In this video, we're going to take a quick look at how humans fit in with the natural world in general. So, as I mentioned before, a unifying theme in biology is evolution. Evolution explains a lot of things, such as how the human body has its form, and also the relationship between humans and other organisms. So, let's start really simple with single-celled organisms. So, life started about 3.5 billion years ago on Earth with very simple single-celled organisms, not unlike bacteria that you see nowadays. And so this was roughly about 1 billion years after the Earth formed. So it took about 1 billion years for life to arise. Now, single-celled life continued for a long time before there was any sort of multicellular life. Multicellular organisms arose about 600 million years ago. Now, as I said, evolution is sort of this unifying theme. And so it might surprise you if I say that actually humans arose from simpler organisms. So, and by simpler, I mean really simple. Like, so your great-great-great-great-great-grandmother many times over was actually a single-celled organism. So that's a bit surprising, but that actually, understanding that we all came from very simple origins, these simple single-celled organisms, actually helps us to understand how life is interconnected and so forth. Here's a picture on this slide of Jane Goodall. She's very famous. She's known for her studies on social and family interactions in chimpanzees out in the wild. So she's human, and so genetically she's very similar to myself or to you. But surprisingly, perhaps, humans and chimpanzees are actually sort of close cousins. So if you look at many of our genes, they're actually identical between humans and chimpanzees. Now, of course, there are some genes that are quite different, and that's again very interesting. That gives rise to the human form being quite different than that of a chimpanzee. So next up, let's take a look at this sort of rough outline of what's going on here. So we have to organize life. And so what scientists have done is they've organized life using a system in which at the very basis of the system, you have these things called domains. Domains are major categories of life. So there are 3 domains. There are bacteria, which you're probably familiar with. Bacteria are sort of everywhere, right? They're both good and bad. They can make you sick, but they can also help with things like digestion and so forth. So bacteria, essentially ubiquitous, meaning they're everywhere. There's archaea, which you're probably less familiar with. Archaea were originally found in places like these thermal pools at Yellowstone National Park. They're similar to bacteria in the sense that they're very simple, primitive, single-celled organisms. Interestingly enough, as you can see in this diagram, archaea are actually more similar to us than bacteria are. So, for example, we're within the group Eukarya, which we'll talk about in a second. But you can see how the branch for Archaea is coming off closer to us than to the bacteria. So Archaea are very simple, but we probably shared a common ancestor some point back in history with the Archaea. Okay, let's move on. So we belong to the Eukarya. So these are also known as the eukaryotes, and they are organisms that include animals, which is we're within the kingdom animals. It also includes protista, fungi, and plantae. So there are 4 kingdoms within this domain Eukarya. So we're going to come back and talk about that a lot more in a second. Let's take a quick look at the organization scheme, though. So we basically, as I said, we have these major categories: the domains, the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya, also known as the eukaryotes. We belong to the Eukarya or eukaryotes. And beyond that, we can start breaking things up a little bit. So if you look at the Eukarya, we have these 4 kingdoms. Now, each kingdom can be broken up into phyla or singular phylum. So within the Animalia, there are many different phyla. Beyond that, we have class, order, family, genus, and species. Each time we're getting more specific. So, for example, when we talk about humans, we are Homo sapiens. So our name actually comes from the genus, which is Homo, and the species is sapiens. So together, Homo sapiens is our species name. Now, this is pretty confusing, but there's a mnemonic to help us remember this. We have Dear King Philip came over for good soup. So that, of course, helps us remember domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Now, there's some other ways of sort of dividing up life. One way is to divide life up as to whether the cells have a nucleus or not. So a cell has a cell membrane, but some cells have another membrane within that membrane, which is the nucleus. And within that nucleus, you have the genetic material, such as DNA. So cells without nuclei are called prokaryotes. Pro means before, and karyote literally means nut or kernel. So it means before the nucleus. So the bacteria and the archaea are fairly simple. They're single-celled organisms. They are prokaryotes. So that a prokaryote is not a domain or anything, but it's just another way of describing life. These are organisms that don't have a nucleus. Now, as I mentioned, we belong to the Eukarya. We're within the kingdom Animalia. So what about the name Eukarya? Well, eu actually means good, well, or it could mean true or genuine. So one interpretation of this etymology or how this word arose is, well, it means true or genuine karyote, which means nut or kernel. So that's what it means, and that's referring to the nucleus. So all these kingdoms within the Eukarya have organisms that all have a true nucleus. That's why they're all placed together within the domain Eukarya. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about some fundamental ways in which we classify life. Again, I've just talked about this presence or absence of a nucleus. So again, the domain bacteria and the domain Archaea lack a membrane-bound nucleus. The domain Eukarya does have a membrane-bound nucleus. We can also divide life up based on whether it's unicellular or multicellular. So bacteria and archaea, they're all unicellular. Humans are multicellular. In fact, all of the organisms within the kingdom Animalia are all multicellular. We can also look at the type of nutrition or metabolism that the organism goes through. So we have producers and consumers. So producers are things that generate organic molecules, which are molecules that have carbon and hydrogen, and they make these complex organic molecules out of simpler raw materials, such as water and CO2. So, and they take in energy through photosynthesis. So if you look at this picture, we have a picture of producers and consumers. So the grass, that's clearly the producer. The grass is doing photosynthesis, taking in CO2, taking in water, taking in very simple raw materials, and then turning those raw materials into complex organic molecules, which we'll talk about later in this class. The consumers, I think you can figure out in this picture, that would be the ewe and the lamb. They're consumers. They're taking in the grass, they're eating it, they're digesting it, and they're essentially deriving energy by the breakdown of the chemicals within the food that they take in. So finally, let's talk a little bit about these kingdoms in a little more detail. So if we look at Eukarya, there's these 4 different kingdoms. So the protists are mostly unicellular. They include things like amoeba. So an amoeba is found in a pond. It sort of moves around. It has these pseudopods, and it chases after things. So it's essentially a hunter, and it's constantly looking for food. There are other things within protists, such as the algae, slime molds. So it's kind of a catch-all group that includes lots of different organisms. Now, they're all generally, again, unicellular and fairly simple, but they do all have a nucleus. So that's why they're placed within the domain Eukarya. Next up, we have the Animalia, or the animals. These are multicellular by definition. They're all consumers. So animals do not do photosynthesis, and so they have to eat either plants or animals to gain chemical energy. Next up, we have the fungi, or fungi. These are multicellular. They include things like yeast, molds, and mushrooms. And then the last category is the plantae, or plants. These are multicellular. They're producers because they can do photosynthesis. And so that brings us to the end here. I've just did a quick tour here, trying to place humans within the categories of life.